welcome again. Well, I've heard nothing from the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or Officer Halfname in the 3 weeks since sending the final notice to stop and covering letter explaining the difference between legal and lawful. My stolen property has not been returned, so I'll be sending an invoice for costs shortly, which will add into the officer's file if they don't start acting lawfully. Meanwhile, it may be that the TGA has hand-passed the ball to the ABF, Australian Border Force, to see if they can get any purchase on the case. We can see here one of 2 seizure notices I received last week, demanding that I access their website and complete a form explaining why I might consider the seizure to be in error, and stating that if my reasons on the form were not convincing to them, that they were statutorily obliged to commence legal proceedings in order to obtain an order for goods to be declared as special forfeited goods and condemned to the Crown. This can be a costly process, and the ABF will seek to recover legal costs from you." End quote. I may withdraw my claim prior to the commencement of legal proceedings if I do not wish to continue the claim process. I'm also advised that any such claim must be made using the approved form Claim for Return of Seized Goods Form B144, and that this must be done within 30 days after a seizure notice was served on me. Naturally, having sent a notice of conditional acceptance, where I have challenged them to prove that they have any jurisdiction over me now that Article 61 is in effect, I shall not be completing any such form, because that would be granting a tacit approval of authority to this bogus Crown agency to be dealing with me at all. They will receive the other notices in due course, together with appropriate covering letters if they attempt any putative rebuttals of my lawful position and standing, and the same advice given to Officer Halfname of their personal liability for their crimes. This case is even a bit more cockeyed than the TGA, because here we don't even have the courtesy of half a name. Instead, it is stated that the notice is served by, quote, an authorised person, unquote, who, quote, reasonably suspects the goods are special forfeited goods as defined in Section 183UA of the Customs Act 1901, end quote. Since there is no identified originator of this false claim, I've addressed my responses to the Deputy Commissioner of the ABF, since he, of course, is ultimately responsible for the behaviour of his underlings. It will be interesting to see if Mr. Dwayne Freeman takes responsibility for this action himself, or orders someone a few rungs down the ladder to sign their name to these treasonous documents, or whether the plan is to try to carry out the entire operation anonymously. If no one else is identified, of course the remaining notices will go to Mr. Freeman. Once again, there is no physical address disqualifying the seizure notice as a lawful document. I expect them to claim, as did Officer Halfname, the illusory protection of invalid legislation as justification for behaving dishonourably regarding the absence of this requirement. On the seizure notice near the top, there are several ABNs that I have researched and listed from the ABN Lookup webpage. 2 of them are the same, while a third relates to the office in the ACT, which is the one I used in my notice to the Deputy Commissioner. It may be that this seizure notice originated in one of the offices covered by the other ABN, but that is not crucial to the process, which is simply to challenge the claim of authority. The one at the very top is the one listed for New South Wales, where the business name listed in full is Australian Border Force Customs Brokers, clearly a corporate structure, the term brokers even indicating that there may be a choice, as with insurance companies or stockbrokers, as to with whom one may choose to deal. Just as with the TGA, as a corporate entity, they are governed by contract law and may not compel anyone to deal with them. Failure to reveal that is a contractual offer with all the privileges of refusal or negotiation, again constitutes conspiracy to commit fraud. But we don't really need to get into that discussion with them at this stage. It only becomes a point when they persist in denying the validity of constitutional law and thereby commit sedition. when it becomes necessary to return the threats by warning of an eventual trial by jury. Naturally, if they decide to instigate legal proceedings, as threatened if I decline to comply with their demands, I shall have to start the notices procedure with the court as well. And if the court decides to issue orders which they want enforced by the police will also have been put on notice by then. It's tiresome having to repulse these fraudulent entities, but it's much better to do that than just meekly submit to their illegitimate claims, surrendering my freedom and making it more difficult for the next generation to preserve or reclaim theirs. It may be during this case that the time will arrive to remind the ABF that they recently, as re-shown in this image, did inspect a package addressed to me which contained the same substance and allowed it to be delivered. That would require an explanation of exactly what are they claiming to be the law. Another good question would be, why are the ABF and the TGA attempting to police the importation of a drug that is available all over Australia in any stock feed vendors without even a prescription? I know of more than one farmer and several other people who have access to ivermectin in this fashion and who take it regularly to ward off parasites and viruses they may encounter. Not one of them has ever had a bad effect from doing so, and while these are only anecdotal accounts, there have been dozens of detailed scientific studies conducted worldwide which show the effectiveness and safety of this medication. Clearly, there is a political rather than a medical agenda at play here. Well, if that's the case, it's time to palm off, to use the rugby parlance, these interlopers, using the true law of the land. We await further developments as before. A secondary point today is the importance of the implications of the document shown here. This letter from the Australian Attorney General's Department is in response to a Freedom of Information request concerning documentation of the existence or number of the constitutional head of power empowering Australian parliaments to implement or charge council rates, or granting the power to councils to do so. After a long-winded explanation of the various sections of the FOI Act, which permit such requests to be denied, and description of the searches conducted seeking these documents, there comes the final admission on page 2 that the documents do not exist within the department's records. Of course, the attempt is made to give the illusion of control to this fakery by stating that the request is being denied, quote, pursuant to section 24A of the FOI Act, unquote. But it is obvious that even had the department been totally willing to supply the information, they could not have done so, because it doesn't exist, and as we all should know, it never has. The referenda seeking permission to authorise local councils to be funded by the Commonwealth Government, or as a third tier of government in Australia, were twice rejected in 1974 and 1988 respectively. While many might be excited by the apparent coup de grace this document gives to the claims of councils to levy rates on property owners, it once again slides into the realm of the legalese system, with arguments revolving around the Australian Constitution, which, as we already have shown, is itself invalid or null and void. There really isn't any need to go down this path, because Article 61 covers everything and immediately negates all arguments or gainsaying. The Council will invariably respond to notices or objections about rates by referring to the relevant Act of State Parliament, which they claim gives them legal authority to levy these charges. And there's little point in arguing back and forth about the Australian Constitution. Constitutional law overrides parliamentary legislation, and in Australia we live under the British Constitution. That is where our argument must ultimately be made, so it makes sense to go there from the start and stay with that position. There's no need to complicate things with arguments about points that are moot. As no one can prove that Article 61 is not in effect, that's the torpedo to hold a fake ship of state below the waterline. Happy hunting.